Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the American Academy of Diplomacy's interview series. I am your host, Joshua Loisel, and I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe during these times. The purpose of this series is to share the experiences of Academy members with students and the general public in the hopes of supporting the Academy's mission of strengthening the appreciation and understanding of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy. We also hope to use this opportunity to inspire the next generation to explore opportunities in the field. Be sure to follow the American Academy of Diplomacy's YouTube channel and follow us on all of our social media pages. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce our next guest, Ambassador Lawrence Greenwood. Prior to his appointment as ambassador to the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, Ambassador Greenwood has served as the vice president at the Asia Development Bank. He has also served in a number of positions at the U.S. State Department and has served at the U.S. embassies in Manila, Dakar, Singapore, and twice in Tokyo. Ambassador Greenwood has also served as Senior Managing Director for Government Relations in Asia for MetLife and is now a Senior Advisor to the Bauer Group in Asia. Ambassador Greenwood, welcome.
Thank you, Joshua. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So I was wondering if we could start in Japan, and I was just wondering if you could talk through your experiences working in Japan. What did you find the most challenging part of your time in negotiations there, and also the most interesting?
Great, yeah. When I was in Japan, I mostly dealt with trade issues and trade negotiations. And I think if you talk to any trade negotiator, he or she will say that the most challenging part of doing trade negotiations is actually negotiating on the US side. So it's actually on your own side is where the more difficult interactions can be, both in terms of dealing with the companies who are complaining and not in a negative way, but maintaining their expectations and getting them to go forward with you. And of course, the interagency process back in Washington as we hammer out kind of the positions we're going to take and the tactics we're going to take in those negotiations. So that was always a challenging part of the of trade negotiations with Japan. It actually had nothing to do with Japan at all, and it's the same case in every country. In terms of Japan, though, I think probably the most challenging as well as the most interesting part of being involved in trade negotiations is the process of digging into an issue and understanding it. So trade negotiations, like actually almost any area, it's all about a lot of details. It's very detail oriented in terms of the actual agreements that are negotiated and hammered out. And what makes trade interesting is that since every sector has its own kind of unique details, you have to really become not the expert, but certainly you need to be very familiar with the industry, with how it works and how competition works in that industry, particularly vis-a-vis Japan. So getting in and digging into the industry, whether it was retail in Japan, for example, I was involved in the negotiations that opened up the retail sector to allow big box stores to open up in Japan. I was involved in telecommunications negotiations in a large number of sectors. As insurance, we opened up insurance. And each of those sectors, you have to, as a foreign service officer, you've got to read into and understand what's going on. You have to read the laws. You have to read the regulations. These are often only in Japanese, so obviously having Japanese language is essential. You have to be able to interview people who know what's going on. You have to find allies within Japan to help us kind of open up the market there. You have to talk to journalists, and because they're often very well informed about what's going on behind the scenes in particular, and just really get in and behind the scenes. And so it requires language ability, requires kind of a proactive stance to get out there and dig out the information. It requires at least in the case of Japan, a fairly strong liver, because a lot of that information is found out through after-hour drinking, and which is a big way of engaging with the Japanese government officials and corporate executives. So that was, and I like that. So that was the fun and challenging part of working in Japan. Probably the best part and the most kind of rewarding aspect of working in Japan is just that we have such a close relationship with Japan. and enjoy the privilege of being able to access almost virtually anybody that we want to talk to in Japan. When you're from the US Embassy, it just opens up doors. And that's not a privilege that we should take for granted. It's obviously something that we worked on in terms of developing a strong partnership and relationship with Japan over many, many years after World War II. And that requires constant care. To build that relationship is really important, because without that relationship, we don't get the access to the decision makers, and we wouldn't have been able to do what we did over the years. Frankly, those kinds of trade liberalization issues are less of a problem now in Japan than they were back in the 80s and 90s when I was working in the embassy. But there still are issues that we, in both our economies, that we need to work out. But those are probably some of the more kind of interesting parts of working in Japan.
Great. So segueing off of that, what are some of the issues that we as Americans often neglect or miss when dealing with economic topics in Asia, and more specifically in Japan in this case?
Yeah, let me start with the macro aspect of that, which is that I think even though most Americans understand that obviously Asia is big and it's got large economic presence, I still think that they probably don't understand fully or fully appreciate the importance that Asian economies have for American prosperity, and the vital importance of having the United States be very closely integrated with the economies in Asia. And this, it became an issue, of course, in the last administration, where we talked about decoupling from China and also reshoring and taking trade actions, not just against China, but other Asian countries as well. And as if we could somehow prosper without Asia. And Asia, as you know, Joshua, has 60% of the world's human beings. It has about 40% of the world GDP. It's got a large percent of world trade. So that's where it's also the fastest growing part of the world. So it's where America is going to get we're going to tap into those workers, we're going to tap into those consumers, tap into that capital, and tap into that growth. And without those resources, we're not going to be able to grow and remain competitive. And I worry about that because of the overall trade picture, right? Free trade is now in retreat in terms of support, not support within the United States. Most Americans support it, but unfortunately in the politics of the United States, trade is in a bad position. And it wasn't just the last administration. Obviously, the last administration was the most overtly protectionist one we've had since World War II, but also we don't still have a strong free trade stance in the current administration either. So far, they're still mulling what they're going to do with the protectionist measures that are in place now. And a lot of those affect our ability to be effective in Asia. And in particular, with Asia now moving forward without us in terms of trade agreements, it's a dangerous time for us to be not putting that kind of emphasis on more fully integrating our economy into that of Asia.
So I have a Japan-specific question, and it's a common conception in the United States that Japan is a nation of savers. And I was just curious, how did you work around that challenge or help the Japanese government in that topic?
Yeah, that was a big issue, particularly back in the late 80s and early 90s. We had, in fact, our whole kind of economic initiative vis-a-vis Japan called the Structural Impediments Initiative under President Bush, the father, was in fact premised on this imbalance of the savings rates between the United States and Japan, where Japan had a relatively high rate of savings. We have low rate of savings. And as a result, the macroeconomic result of that is that you have, and still have, recurrent current account imbalances. We have a current account deficit vis-a-vis Japan, and they have a surplus. And that, of course, does have impact on, particularly back then, not so much now, but had impact on U.S. employment, impact on manufacturing employment. And so that was, the idea was to talk to Japan about raising its savings rates. And in fact, and savings in Japan, and in any economy, is largely in three buckets. You have consumer household saving, you have government saving, that is fiscal policy, and then you have corporate saving. What's happened since, though, is that, in fact, Japanese households have become less of a saver. So their savings rate has gone from one of the highest in OECD back in the 80s to one of the lowest now. It's among the lowest. And so there's not the same kind of household saving, lack of consumption type of problem in Japan that we had back in the 80s and 90s. And also fiscal policy, of course, has been very expansionary. We were successful, I guess, in talks with them because they originally ramped up fiscal spending, maybe excessively in some people's cases, because Japan now has one of the highest GDP to debt to GDP ratios in the world. The problem now is corporate savings. And so in Japan, you have very high corporate savings, a lot of cash. That is partly the result of a corporate governance system that doesn't put a lot of pressure on management to effectively use corporate capital and corporate cash. So because of the kind of lack of shareholder activity or activism, in part, you don't have a lot of pressure to use that excess capital effectively to get higher rates of return. And this actually does translate into a problem for American companies. I mean, one of the remaining, I don't want to say barriers, but maybe impediments is the right word, impediments to American companies doing well in Japan is that it's a difficult place to compete because returns, corporate returns for the competitors, Japanese competitors, are so low, and there's no pressure on them to increase their profits. And so it's very difficult for example, when I was in MetLife in Japan, we were competing against Japanese companies that had rates of return that were on their capital that were extremely low, and that just wasn't acceptable to our headquarters. And so, how to compete against what I would call nonprofit organizations, Japanese corporates, was quite difficult. So that's a problem for Japan as well, because they need to actually use that capital more effectively, particularly as they age and they have these productivity issues that they have to confront. How do they grow their economy? That's one of the major ways of doing that, of course, is to employ that corporate capital more effectively. And we are seeing changes in the corporate governance area. And it was something we actually used to talk about in our bilateral economic talks. We haven't, though, for the last maybe decade or so. Maybe it's something we should take up more with them.
Great. So I have a question that's going to launch us into the next few questions that I have posed for you. And that is, in addition to spending much of your time in your career in bilateral economic issues, you also served as U.S. Ambassador to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And I was wondering, what are some of the different challenges that multilateral work presents compared to bilateral work?
Right. I mean, obviously, the most obvious one is that you're working with many more kind of bureaucratic cultures, right? So you're not dealing just with one country, but dealing with, in the case of APEC, 20 other economies, and each of them, of course, have their own unique bureaucracies and bureaucratic cultures, their unique set of red lines and areas where they have difficulties. So the main thing I spent a lot of time when I was doing APEC work is, I mean, basically APEC is all about creating new economic norms of behavior. It's not you don't negotiate trade agreements in APEC. Basically, you negotiate norms. You try to persuade other Asian Pacific countries to move in a certain direction that in our case, we thought was helpful for American interests, and so getting an initiative going forward. Well, the most famous one in APEC is the Information Technology Agreement in the late '90s, which began in APEC, and this basically zeroed out tariffs on computers and peripherals and basically IT type of equipment, which actually laid the groundwork for the supply chains that we now have. That are very deeply enmeshed in Asia generally, and frankly make it possible for Apple to sell this product with at a relatively reasonable charge, but it would cost thousands of dollars if it wasn't for the ITA, the Information Technology. And so so the work involves just sitting down and going. It's a lot of travel because you have a lot of these senior official meetings, 4 of them a year, when you're going out to the host country, and you're sitting down and having just 20 bilateral meetings and virtually almost every day. So it's just kind of one bilateral after another. It's like speed dating. You sit down for 30 to 45 minutes with each of the delegates, and you keep doing that over and over for the 2-week period that you're there to try to get to get them to agree, to hammer out a consensus. And so that was challenging, fun. I enjoyed that. There's also a lot of the one way that APEC, one of the factors that makes APEC, I think, work is the kind of camaraderie that also it generates, and they do that through these frequent face-to-face meetings. I think part of the problem with COVID is that we don't have that now, and doing online meetings is great, but in fact, it really does take away from something that's important in APEC, and that is the social engagement between the senior officials and their staffs, where you really do get to know people, you develop trust, credibility. And in Asia in particular, as you know, you follow, I think, China in particular, I mean, trust and credibility is so important. I mean, it's important in every country, obviously, but in Asia, because of the culture, I think even more important than other regions. And so that is, the social interactions. You may have heard about the APEC, that we even do little skits every year. So we're every delegation has to come up with a skit, musical or comedy or whatever. And there's a night of eating and drinking and skits that, that kind of silliness actually has a real important purpose, which is to create those kinds of feelings of friendship and collegiality, which makes the very difficult discussions on policy a lot easier. So that was it. And then the other thing with APEC, of course, is that you do have the leaders meeting every year, and that was important for the institution, obviously, because bringing in the leaders gives it a lot more heft, obviously. But as a foreign service officer, involved in working that, it's always a lot. It's both challenging and just a lot of fun being involved in those presidential trips, right? Because as the ambassador, you're the substantive person who is setting the agenda, the substantive agenda. Obviously, the White House is driving a lot of this as well, but the substantive agenda is basically yours, and you got to sell it to the White House. They have to sell it to the president. It's obviously exciting to be kind of, when the president's on the ground and you're the guy, right, running around, doing the work. It's just it's a thrill, and even after 30 years, you don't get jaded by that. And, dealing with the president of the United States is still pretty exciting.
Absolutely. So similar in terms of dealing with different types of bureaucracies and things like that is my next question is a topic that not all young students or foreign service officers look into, is the role they have in engaging in interagency policy process. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, right. So as folks who are in the service know, but maybe not outside so much. I mean, when you go into the foreign service, roughly, it depends on the person, but roughly half of your career is going to be in Washington, D.C., working in the department, and half out at embassies. So you're not spending your entire time, moving the world at embassies. And that, again, that ratio can change depending on the person, how much you kind of either want to be in Washington or just to end up being in Washington. And the work is very different. So the work of the embassy is they have input into policy, but the main work of the embassy is to implement policy and execute it. And the main work of Washington, D.C. is obviously to form that policy and to make it, and then instruct the embassies to do their thing. And so again, the work is quite different. In Washington, D.C., interagency process is a free-for-all in a sense. I mean, it can be very rough, and there's a lot of yelling involved, and the smoothness of it depends a lot on the White House and the White House staff in terms of their ability to kind of bring people together and get them to work effectively. But even the most effective, NECs and NSCs, there still is a lot of conflict as people try to get their point of view across. And a lot of it is institutional, some of it's personal, and it's you've heard the comment, maybe it was Midarek who's talked about the the policy process being a sausage. It's like making a sausage. It's nice. It tastes good when it comes out, but you don't want to know how it's made. And that's a little bit what it's like. It can be pretty rough, but it's also interesting and fascinating for me because I'm a policy nerd. And being involved in that is great. And it's not just with the other agencies. Of course, Congress is very much involved. And of course, you have the lobbyists and the corporates in the economic area where I worked that are obviously very much involved as well. So, bringing all those interests and inputs into the policy process, hammering out a position, and then what State Department is mainly doing for all that is providing input into what kind of policy would make most sense and would be most successful on the ground. So we know the situation in these countries better than the other agencies, and we know what's more likely to work and what's certainly likely to fail. And so that's the main input that we're doing is getting that input in there about what's happening on the ground. We have probably the best, most immediate intel. And in the economic area in particular, most of the intel is coming from State Department. It doesn't come from the intelligence agency so much. They've been trying to do more in that area, but frankly, most of this is open source material. So it's not that difficult it's difficult to get in the sense you got to drink and talk and stuff like that to get it, but it's not like it's secret. And getting that into the process is the main thing that we do. The most challenging part of the interagency process is that you're typically, as an FSO, you're typically dealing with other government officials, U.S. government officials who know their area far better than you do, right? So you're talking, if you're working on Paris Club debt rescheduling or a telecommunications negotiation, the people you're dealing with in the first case in Treasury or in Commerce Department on telecom are going to know that issue so much better than you, and you still have to be able to keep up. So it's a little bit like going out to post, learning a language, getting to know the issues out there. It's for FSOs have to have an ability to get up to speed very quickly on an issue, and they have to be able to essentially adapt and adopt the vocabulary, right? They have to be able to talk the talk, even if they don't have necessarily the kind of expertise that you're dealing with your counterparts. I found that one of the best ways of being valuable to an interagency team as a State Department guy was to volunteer to be the note taker on meetings, because whether it's foreign meetings or domestic meetings, because frankly, nobody likes to be note taker. It's kind of a thankless job, but FSOs are good at it. We do so much note taking in our careers, particularly at Post, and we're trained for it. And so it's if you're a good writer, I enjoyed it. I like note taking and kind of producing that very that good meeting memo. I entered the Foreign Service during when Secretary Kissinger was the Secretary of State, and he had extremely demanding, standards for note taking. So once you volunteer to be a note taker, you're the most popular guy on the delegation because no one else has to do it. That's okay, Larry will do it. So that's one little tactic I used to increase my value added.
Absolutely. So you started to touch upon this, and I was just wondering if you could expand upon it. So what are some of the struggles and the successes that you had in your time as a Foreign Service officer working between agencies for policy creation?
I think this one of the struggles, but it's a struggle we should have is dealing with Congress, and so. And in particular the House, where you have representatives who are obviously very close to their constituents, but not at all experts on foreign policy in most cases. In some cases, obviously, there's some that are extremely expert, but it's rare. And often Congress brings very what's the right word, narrow, I would say, interests. They would have, for example, bring in Cuban interests if you're from Miami, or Vietnam, very conservative Vietnamese type of interest if you're from Southern California. and are pushing, or human rights advocates, for example, who are pushing a very narrow, I'm not saying unimportant, but narrow concern that you've got to take it into account, but you can't let necessarily drive policy. And so how you keep those kind of interests and how you get them into the process and incorporate them in a meaningful way without letting them essentially distort policy is always a challenge. So yeah, and congressional pressure, it seems like in my career, always seemed to take place around 7:30 at night. So it always meant that you had to spend, your evenings and into way past your dinner time with your family, dealing with these last minute congressional crises. And so again, I think it's a good thing in a sense that foreign policy fundamentally does have to be driven by domestic policy and domestic interests. I mean, that is not a ethereal thing that's just out there that we foreign policy advocates make up. I remember I had a Japanese colleague from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we were eating and drinking, and he was just lamenting the politicization of foreign policy in Japan. He said, we have these domestic interests that want to affect our foreign policy. And I said, my response was, welcome to the club. I mean, that's what democracies are. So, it's a good thing, but it's messy and it's difficult and can be challenging, keeping everyone kind of not happy, because you're never going to keep everybody happy, but, satisfied enough that they aren't going to, get your budget the next time it comes around. So that's a challenge. The interagency process can also be challenging because, again, you're dealing with, it's a similar thing with the, because often you're dealing with people that are focused often more on domestic policy than foreign policy and don't have a strong appreciation for how to deal with foreign countries. We saw it sometimes in our trade negotiations in Japan, for example, where most trade negotiators from USTR, not most, but they tend to be lawyers. And in the American kind of lawyer culture, there is certainly a strong strain of theatrics, I guess I would call it, where in a negotiating room, there's yelling and raising a voice and that kind of courtroom drama type of stuff that American lawyers tend to think is effective. And it might be effective in an American negotiation, but it's not effective in a negotiation with Japan. Japanese tend to see anger as a sign of weakness. If you, signs of anger, a show of anger is, and certainly a show of theatrics they see as a sign of weakness, not strength. And so it actually is counterproductive to do that in a Japanese negotiation. Now, there are plenty of times when, in fact, because they got so used to dealing with us and our theatrics, that they would also, some of their more famous trade negotiators would kind of adopt this American style of yelling and, jumping up and running out of the room and stuff like that. But that was rare, and it wasn't really Japanese. It was just their reaction and saying, well, we'll play by your rules. But if you want to get things done in Japan, you don't get angry, you don't try to bluster. And so, getting people to understand that and the important, most Americans understand the importance of mutual respect, but I think they don't understand quite as well as they should the importance of true sincerity. Japanese are very good at reading body language. It's partly because of their language, partly because of their culture, partly because they live in a very densely populated country. But they're very good at kind of sussing out what the other person is feeling and thinking, even without them having to say it. And so when Americans try to use flattery, but which in an insincere way, even though it may sound sincere to Americans' ears, Japanese can figure it out really quickly that they're just being flattered and that there isn't really respect there. And once that happens, then credibility, trust is destroyed. It's very hard to make progress in the negotiation. The Japanese respond really well to people that they know respect them, even if they're tough in negotiations. The Japanese don't have a problem with tough negotiators. They actually like them, I think. People like Wendy Cutler and Ira Shapiro. These are the old negotiators. They're very well respected in Japan because they know that these negotiators respected the Japanese for who they are. So, but getting that across to all the other negotiators wasn't always easy, and it's frustrating to kind of see things going on in the negotiating, particularly when you're you're an FSO 2 or 1, so you're not really senior enough to kind of pipe up and say, no, don't do that. But you have to do it kind of, diplomatically, in the corridors or something like that to try to get to push people to take a more productive approach.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. So my last two questions for you have to deal with your time working in the private sector. I'm just curious, how did working at the State Department prepare you for your job in the private sector?
Yeah, I think this is important. I mean, obviously for students coming out of school now or young people looking at foreign service as a career, I know it's kind of early to think about how a 20, 30-year career in foreign service can help prepare them for the next step, because they're not thinking that far ahead. But it actually is useful to think that far ahead. And these days, of course, you don't have to spend 20 years or 30 years in the service. I mean, I should say though that one of the things about the foreign service is that there is that kind of expectation. It's like the military, where you're not required to stay in that long, and you can always leave, of course. But that the career is really, and the profession is really based around a career type of approach. And there's problems with that, and in fact, the State Department has struggled with that and is struggling today with that, because most young people, don't think of themselves being in one job for 30 years. And increasingly that's not the case certainly in other areas like the civil service or the private sector. But having said all that, working in the State Department does help. You land a nice job after. Whether you leave after a career or only after 10 years. Because and in particular, it's good for jobs like the one I had, government relations jobs or public policy jobs in companies. Increasingly, companies understand that they have to have a relationship with foreign governments in the markets that they're working in, just as they do have lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And that they can't just they just can't rely on the fact that they're a great company with great technology that the country wants and needs. They really have to be in there to help make sure that, first of all, that the country doesn't take steps that are going to hurt them as a company. But just as importantly, that you shape future regulations in the area that you're working that are going to be conducive to your industry and to your position as a company. So, stopping bad things from happening and shaping new regulations is an important function for particularly large multinational corporations. And that's basically what economic officers do. I mean, that's what our job is to help. A large part of our job, and there's other aspects, but particularly in the trade and investment area, a large part of our job is to help American companies get market access in foreign markets. And by in particular looking at regulations, policies, practices that are stopping them, impeding them from competing and even setting up in some cases. So that's that skill set from moving to as an economic officer to working in a company to help them deal with those kinds of regulatory policies and practices is ideal. And so whether it's a job in Washington working for as a government relations person there for an American company, or in the markets out in my case in Asia, it's a good opportunity. So and then of course the longer you stay in, the more contacts you have and the more useful you are to a company in order to get access to to certain people. And I should maybe add that because government relations is a relatively new field, even in the United States, although now it's 30 years, but certainly in foreign markets, it's a relatively new function in the sense of of government relations in the American sense. That is, I should start by saying by clean government relations. Most government relations people maybe in a foreign market are the ones who carry the bags of cash to bribe bureaucrats. That's not the kind of government relations that I'm talking about, because obviously if you do that as an American working for an American company, you go to jail, and that's against the Foreign Practices Act. Since fortunately the rest of the world knows that, we actually have kind of a privileged position in the sense that no one's ever asked me for a bribe, when I was working for MetLife, because they knew the answer already. Of course, it would be no. And so you have the ability to be able to operate in that kind of cleaner environment. It may be at a disadvantage in the sense you can't get to certain people or certain things happen if somebody else is bribing them, but you don't have to worry about dealing with that conundrum yourself because it's simply not on the table. And increasingly, other countries are understanding the value of that kind of model of government relations. And you're seeing it in Japan now. Government relations is now becoming a kind of profession in Japan for helping Japanese companies as they're dealing with outside governments, as well as government relations firms in Japan helping foreign companies deal with the Japanese government. So yeah, it's a great opportunity. Let me just Joshua, just take a couple of minutes just to mention that if you're interested in foreign policy, that there's a lot of other kind of opportunities for careers as well. We talked about the Foreign Service, but of course there's a civil service, and there's a lot of interesting foreign policy jobs there, in particular for people who are interested in one particular area. In the Foreign Service, you're a generalist. And so even though I did focus on Japan and Asia, I also did Africa, Middle East. I was the Iraqi Economic Task Force Director. I was done European stuff, Latin America stuff. But if you're interested in one area, human rights or China or, one country, then civil service actually might be more interesting because then you can focus your entire career on that, spend it in State Department or Commerce Department, Treasury. And that can be interesting. The other possibilities are nonprofits, and I ran a nonprofit after leaving MetLife for 4 years, the Local Japan Society, and that could be very rewarding, fulfilling way of contributing to foreign policy, grassroots support for a relationship. In my case, the relationship with Japan is a vital part of foreign policy, and so you are making a difference. You have, we mentioned the private sector, and then you have think tanks and also maybe the nonprofit area. So there's lots of different ways of being involved in foreign policy other than being a foreign service officer.
Great, thank you. And I think you started to touch on this. My last question that I had was that not many young students such as myself think about going into the private sector first or even consider it afterwards, like you had mentioned. And I was just curious what advice you would give to us on spending some time in the private sector or even starting.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, one way to kind of start off is, obviously I have sons who have just gone through their first, just in the last, I guess, 10 years have gone through their search for that first job, right? And it's just so hard, and I'm very sympathetic. I remember doing it myself, and it's very stressful. So getting that first job is tough, and so looking at things like entry-level jobs or even internships in consulting companies to go back to what I do now. So I work for a company called Bauer Group Asia, and they have a number of youngish, I mean, not super young, not straight out of school typically, but youngish people who work as staffers there, doing research or working with clients, and it's a good way of making contacts, getting a kind of a sense of what business needs, right, when they're looking for help from a government relations consulting company. Think tanks, great place to start because not great pay, but working as an intern or getting started in think tank is great for making contacts because think tanks are not just kind of academic institutions. They're actually the main, a big part of their function is fundraising, and a big part of that is working with companies. And so it does go back to corporates, and so. Working as an intern and getting those contacts with company reps and people, you get that exposure, right, to people that are working in that area and working with companies, not just substantively, but also from the corporate side, is a good way to start and get that kind of get your foot in the door, because it's not easy getting these jobs. Well, most of the GR jobs, the government relations jobs, do require, at more senior levels, require some kind of background, whether it's corporate or government, and so getting that foot in the door through an internship, entry level at maybe a consulting company, a think tank, that's probably a better place to start.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Greenwood. Those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you once again for making the time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Be sure to follow us on our YouTube channel and our social media and tune in for our next interview series. Thank you again, Ambassador Greenwood.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. Take care.